All right, welcome back, everybody. This is our final session of the day. We are in the home stretch, and so I'm not going to delay any further. What I'm going to do is introduce the members of our panel. We have Rob Fleming, Executive Director and Co-Chair of BC CAT, and we also have joining us Yvette Monroe, Executive Director from the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer, and we have Anne-Marie Lysing, Director of the Alberta Council on Admissions and Transfer Secretariat and Learner Pathways. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone to the final session of BC CAT's 2020 Online Jam. Thank you for joining us and for all the work you do to support educational pathways and learner mobility for BC students. I'm happy to be joining you today from my office on the downtown campus of BCIT, which is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. The topic of this session is interprovincial collaboration with a focus on work across provincial and territorial jurisdictions to facilitate integration of transfer pathways and technologies in Canada. To provide some context, I'll offer a brief overview of the participating councils on admissions and transfer in Canada and our history of working together. Then we'll move on to a few set questions and topics focusing on educational responses to circumstances arising from the pandemic, current and future areas of collaboration, and development of a national network for transfer in Canada. And we'll set aside some time afterwards for general questions and discussions in the chat room. So I'm going to move now to the slide deck. Yes. Thank you, Mike. As you can see from this first slide, there has been quite a bit of history in Canada of us collaborating together. Initially in 2008, the Western provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, began meeting to talk about areas of common interest to facilitate understanding across our provinces. Jumping forward to 2012 and 2013, a national organization was incorporated, the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer, which really is a combination of organizations like BC CAT and ONCAT and ACAT, but also the post-secondary institutions across Canada that are engaging in credit transfer. So it's much more of a focus on the frontline operation of credit transfer for students. Into 2014, as the landscape in Canada started to change and more councils on admissions transfer were developed, we expanded to form what's called the CAT-CAN network, or the Councils on Admissions Transfer Network in Canada, which has now grown to include 7 organizations: the BC Council on Admissions and Transfer, the Alberta Council on Admissions and Transfer, the Ontario version, one in Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So we're quite a robust network at this point. And we have signed a formal memorandum of understanding to collaborate in the work we do. And we also are now working more directly with the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer to support more student-facing tools and websites that can be offered for people to use. So if I can jump, Mike, to the next slide. Thank you. Just for reference purposes, Alberta has hosted for us a couple of pages that describe the CAT-CAN network. You can see it there, and describe some of the collaborative projects or initiatives that we're engaged in. And we'll talk about some of those today, but if you want to learn more, please feel free to go to this website and follow up with any one of us. Mike? Finally, here, I wanted to point out to you the website for the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer, which also hosts an annual conference, often in association with the Registrars Group in Canada, the Association of Registrars of Universities and Colleges in Canada. And this organization has also engaged in many research projects with provincial bodies, but also with that Registrars Network to create something called the Transcript and Transfer Guide, which is really a common place we can all go to look at nomenclature related to credit and transfer in Canada and to learn about our related practices. Next slide, please, Mike. Thank you. As we shift focus now to the topic of this discussion, I wanted to just draw your attention to something you probably would have seen earlier in the week with the initial COVID-19 panel, and that is the BC CAT system news page. There are similar kinds of resources that are developed in other jurisdictions as well, whose purpose is to provide information to institutions on what each institution is doing by way of providing educational accommodations for students. So if you haven't seen that site, please feel free to have a look. Thank you. Next slide, please. So for this particular session, we have 3 questions that are going to guide us. And as an opening panel for the JAM this year was really focused on BC responses to educational accommodations for students, we're going to take the focus now to Alberta and Ontario. So with that, I'm going to pose this question first to you, and then we'll go to Anne-Marie. Please describe some of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on post-secondary educational practices in your province and the issues that have emerged in relation to admissions and transfer.
So I will touch on a couple. Glad to join everybody here today. I'll talk a little bit about delivery, assessment, grading, and transfer admissions. So in terms of delivery in Ontario, we went online effective mid-March, very much like other jurisdictions, and we've stayed online for the most part. In the late spring, a few institutions, I would say special cases in these instances, were permitted to bring students back to campus if their graduation was really dependent on completion of an in-person element, like a lab or something like that. But the majority of institutions in Ontario, probably like rest of Canada, remain online for the academic year. We also saw, as a result of the pandemic, a number of institutions look at alternate ways of conducting assessments, doing things like alternatives to final exams or exams, and a few institutions piloted virtual online exam or proctoring technology. The government of Ontario, I think, was unique, perhaps in this case, and entered into a partnership to secure a vendor for provincial online proctoring in partnership with an umbrella organization in Ontario. And the intention was to offer this as a more cost-effective option for institutions, and we saw a number of institutions take that up. In regards to grading, we saw the pandemic. This was an area where we saw a lot of policy and practice change. Very early on in the pandemic, we noticed that a number of institutions were instituting what we would call more grading flexibility. So primarily to reduce student stress. This took the form, and I'm sure this was the same in Alberta and BC as well, options like pass or fail or credit, no credit options. And there certainly was uptake of these options, particularly around universities. I think colleges, some of them considered it, and then in the end, many of them opted not to do that. And what we also saw in Ontario was that the advising and supports to students to help them, to counsel them, to make those choices was pretty mixed across the province, I'm going to be saying, to be honest. And so some institutions, when students were looking at pass-fail options, were required to meet with an advisor in advance of making that selection or choosing that, whether it was for select courses or for all of the courses in the remainder of that semester. And other institutions allowed students to sort of implement more of a self-directed option in doing that. From our perspective as a transfer organization, the pass-fail option, while we understood that from a flexibility perspective, it did raise some concerns and challenges. We have a number of transfer pathway and articulation agreements in Ontario between institution to institution, where grades either for particular courses or GPA is really contingent on transfer credit assessment or transfer credit awarded. So where institutions really implemented pass-fail options, we were concerned really about what the implications would that be for students if they were transferring. Certainly, while the pandemic is still going on, most of the institutions expressed flexibility and generosity to be able to, put some of those policies aside and accept students with pass-fail options. But of course, we also know that sometimes students transfer take a while to transfer. They may not transfer for a couple of years or even, 3, 4, or 5 years down the road. And it'll be harder for them. And we're concerned a little bit on them having to explain sort of what their transcript looks like as a result of the pandemic for, if they're transferring a couple of years down the road. Transfer admissions in Ontario, we did struggle with that during the pandemic. In Ontario, the transfer student pool is a bit smaller, certainly than direct entry, and in some cases, even compared to international students. And for many institutions, especially those that might, have smaller transfer enrollments, they really struggled early on to figure out, what was happening. The communication within institutions was certainly challenged as a result of the pandemic. And questions like, would transfer pathway agreements be honored? Would transfer students be able to defer their admission if they were accepted? These were questions that were really circulating in the sector. And it took us some time to get those answers. We are very happy that we could, as a stewardship organization, step into that role and really try to get those questions asked out, across the sector. We did that in collaboration with the networks that represent registrars in Ontario, as well as colleges and universities. We were able to gather that information looking at COVID academic policies and practices, similar to surveys that would have been done in BC and Alberta, and make sure we got that information into those that were supporting transfer students directly. That was a really important thing to do because I think institutions were really struggling during that time.
Thanks very much, Yvette. Over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you. And also very happy to be here from Alberta, and also excited to say that it's not -7 today, so that's a good start. Well, related to the key topic, and Yvette provided a great introduction for so much of, I think, what's being experienced across the country and, well, across the world in a lot of ways, certainly related to COVID-19, related to the effects on the key topics of, as Yvette mentioned, delivery and assessment, aspects of grading, transfer and admissions, and certainly many other topics, everything from IT equity and access, etc. There's a lot of key things happening for sure. I would concur with a number of the findings that Yvette illustrated here, and certainly highlight that some of the things related to delivery and assessment, while they may have a certain effect in a particular semester, similar to the statements of going all full virtually in the March 2020 for most, right, if not all, and then seeing that progress as we got through summer and spring to now winter, seeing mostly online, but seeing a combination of different things, mostly to support work integrated learning labs and other key aspects, but also to try to blend that key campus experience, which there's certainly been a lot of feedback from students on feeling like they aren't getting what they need necessarily overall, but that's not a fault situation, it's a context. And I think that huge impact that goes alongside looking at what's happening with delivery and assessment, both K-12 and post-secondary and in the labor market world, but also how then grading, as Yvette mentioned, the credit, no credit, and some of the effects of that longer term, seeing credential recognition, transfer recognition and policies, admissions recognition and policies, diploma examination changes in the K-12 world. You see these different effects. And generally for the March 2020 onward, folks are doing their best to recognize things as they are because it's beyond students' control for sure. That said, as we go forward, and hopefully this doesn't last for too many more terms and months, but it will continue to have an effect. So that's led us to have discussion, I think, as CATs and with registrars to say, how do we track this information? So I think there's been some really good dialogue. I know that leads a little bit into the next subset of questions around challenges and opportunities. I think trying to find good ways to track that and to be able to better see that almost as a sense of data ongoing is really important, because this semester or these semesters will affect students for terms to come. And that's important to recognize both their grading, their recognition, and also that we want them to succeed. And I think thinking of our registrars or institutions, us as CATs, etc., whatever the case may be, I think time has been a major impact for everybody. That I know of many people who, well, there's also nowhere to go, as some commented, but it's also just a reality of life that there weren't a lot of vacations. I know this seems like a little thing, but it's a huge thing, that the amount of time taken to address COVID is that big elephant in the room, right? Because we are doing everything else that's certainly needed at the same time. And then the changes in process, the effects on relationships. I know that's not directly the question, but it does affect practices, and it does affect some of the access to information that we want to even further increase for students.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie and Yvette. I mean, you started to touch on it a little bit, but one of the thoughts I had in reflection is what are the approaches or activities that we think have worked well, and what are ones that maybe could have been a little bit better to try and mitigate impact on students? I know from my perspective, and in BC, a key activity has been to jump into cross-sector, cross-institution dialogue as quickly as possible. When I think back on it, I'd want to be even more engaged more quickly, because certainly one of the things we saw as institutions were doing wonderful things to try and address the situation and accommodate students. Decisions were a little bit uneven, or timing and communication was a little bit uneven. So certainly we saw it important of our role to facilitate dialogue across those institutions and provide that information to students as best we could by aggregating it and providing it on a website. But what also worked well here too is a group was struck in relationship with the ministry and the post-secondary institutions, so that we were meeting across all of our institutions once every week or two in key areas like technology, like learning continuity. And that was extremely helpful to share information and to help others as they make their own institution-specific decision in a way that is reflective of the system as a whole. And it certainly helped BC CAT to identify emerging issues, as you've mentioned, in relationship to admissions, for example, but also need for articulation or re-articulation of courses that might be emerging as a result of curricular change. So we were able to more actively engage to get parties at the table to have that discussion. There's a lot of anxiety, not only for students, but for faculty. So what are your thoughts on, in your jurisdictions, what worked particularly well and maybe what could have been a little bit more effective? Yvette?
Those are really good questions, actually. I will say in Ontario, certainly what worked well, we have at ONCAT a very, very large network of what we would call student-facing transfer personnel. So it's a group of, on any given day, possibly 150 members. And so we were very, very quickly able to tap into that group and have sessions to really ascertain, what the challenges were that they were facing. And a lot of the times it was just, the trickle down of information. Of course, deans, senior administrators, certainly at the height of the pandemic, we're still in it. Really we're in a lot of intensive meetings, but it takes time, especially for information to trickle down across an institution, into faculties, into folks' hands that are dealing with students. And students were absolutely very stressed out. Whether you were receiving or sending students were very stressed out. And so our ability to gather that group and provide a space for people really kind of in a cone of silence, sometimes to vent, sometimes to ask questions. It was also the place where we really found out what the key questions were, and also share information was really, I think, a good thing that came out of it. I'm going to say, with my colleagues here from BC and Alberta, the opportunity that I had personally to meet with my colleagues across the country, we have, regular meetings, whether it's once a month, through PCCAT or through CatCan, or, just touching base with Robin and Marie, was very, very helpful. It was helpful just to hear that other jurisdictions, other institutions were grappling with the same. It wasn't easy to deal with that, but to try to come to solutions together. So I think that was a real plus. In terms of what could be improved, that's probably lots of things could be improved. I would say in comparison, Ontario really has some very established sector umbrella organizations representing the colleges and the universities. Very quickly, they mobilized to support their sectors. And I would say that there was fairly regular exec head or dean meetings, of the college and universities. And they had fairly regular, weekly perhaps meetings with the minister or the minister's office. The situation for Indigenous institutes in Ontario is quite different because their structure isn't the same. And so they were certainly more challenged. But one of the things I will observe in terms of what could have been improved is that in Ontario, it seemed a little bit different than BC. A lot of times those meetings happened sector by sector. So there were gatherings and meetings for colleges and gatherings and meetings on a regular basis for universities. That, I think, in some ways created a bit of a silo. Well, not a bit. I think it created quite a bit of silo. There was not a lot, in my opinion, of cross-sectoral conversation. And of course, keep in mind that in Ontario, a lot of institutions were still working on establishing their relationship with the government. We had a government that was elected, not that long ago, and it was a government that changed from a government that had been in place for several terms. And so what that led to in those sector conversations was, I'm going to say, quite a bit of misinformation. One sector would think that there was a different conversation or efforts in terms of advocacy or lobbying underway by one sector, and that wasn't particularly helpful, especially during a pandemic. And so I'm going to say that what could have been improved is maybe more of a format like what happened, it sounded like, in BC, where there is more cross-sectoral conversation, involving colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes, as opposed to responding and dealing with them in silos.
Thanks, Yvette. Anne-Marie, your thoughts?
I think related to that, I would strongly concur with the collaboration piece. And it's so important that, certainly from our perspective, that we were able to connect, that we were able to see what was happening with each other, both as CATs and then also with our respective institutions, and be able to share that across boundaries. Also, just share the experience is pretty darn important. It's not exactly an everyday occurrence, thank goodness, that we're all having right now related to the pandemic. I think, too, that a close connection to the Alberta Registrar Association and to also our First Nations colleges, to contact persons as we have at the institutions, similar to some of the things Yvette's saying as a real positive, that collaboration and talking through the effects of COVID, doing things such as the discussions around the online delivery and assessment, grading, the effects on transfer in the future, the effects on both high school and post-secondary admissions, being able to have that kind of dialogue and really understand what key things are working and what aren't, being able to get information out, the collaboration with the network itself, so very important. I think it affects a positive way that we were able to set up the webpage on Transfer Alberta and be able to link to the other jurisdictions who have that similar information and link to each of our institutions' COVID pages, making it easier to find what's happening in different terms, what's happening with grading practices, etc. And also some common information on alberta.ca that we collaborate with the ministry here to make sure that common information is going out for students as well. And that's a key piece that also comes back to it. And Yvette and Rob both mentioned that in different parts, that ultimately it's important that we have a collaborative front to get information to where it's needed most critically, which is with our students. And I think, too, that collaboration across government is one of those things that perhaps happened a little bit slower just because there were so many critical things in health that needed to be addressed without question first. And so we started to connect with the K-12, with advanced ed, with apprenticeship, with labor, with health, with CATs, other organizations as relevant like Apply Alberta, etc. The tracking of all of that is so very important so that you know what's happening where and how you can best be together on something so key as these next steps that we all need about the pandemic. And I think that tracking of key challenges and addressing them with collaborative information sharing going forward is going to be a really important thing for us all, for sure.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I appreciate that. And the work you're mentioning on sharing information across jurisdictions in a pretty comprehensive way will be useful for all of our schools, I think, in each province to develop a shared memory over time. I want to shift the conversation a little bit now to really focus on examples of collaborative transfer system initiatives that we have worked on across provinces and territories, that we are working on and that we hope to work on in the future. Maybe I'll jump in first and say that a key focus for all of us is to really try to develop digital interoperability of our technologies, our software, and our data, so that we can increase efficiencies in sharing information across our borders and have a more comprehensive look at student mobility in Canada. For BC, from BC perspective, a key initiative a few years ago that we embarked upon was a partnership with Campus Manitoba, where effectively we were sharing our transfer credit system, the software that underlies the database that populates the BC Transfer Guide, and business processes with Manitoba because they wanted to develop a technology. This is a great benefit for them because they're not starting from zero, and a great benefit for us because we're able to get a refreshed platform, renewed software, with machine readable data standards, all that good stuff that Mike likes to talk about, and have that back at really at no cost. And that's led to us redeveloping our system and producing what's now known as the Atomic TCS. This conversation is extended across provinces, and though we haven't always shared the same exact platform, we've been developing things out with that in mind, that we need to be able to have information that can be shared back and forth. So I think it's a really positive outcome. And I know now that Ontario is taking a look at their system. That'll be a big part of our conversation, is how BC CAT and Alberta, which has recently developed its own its renewed system, can be aligned with and perhaps share out information with Ontario. And we're having similar conversations with Saskatchewan. So I think that's a really good a good thing to emphasize. Yvette, your thoughts on this question?
Excellent question, and very timely for us. So, just a little bit of background. In Ontario, I'm going to be honest, we're still on version 1 in terms of our online province-wide transfer system database. And it's a database that is both public-facing to provide students with information to support their transfer planning and their next move, but it's also used by our partner institutions. We really, look to the models that exist in BC and Alberta, for instance, your TCS. We've heard Mike speak about it several times as more advanced versions. And it's really key for us. So this past year, ONCAT did launch a new strategic plan, and we were able also to negotiate with the government support for us to move to version 2.0. And many of the things, Rob, that you said are exactly the kind of things that we think are really important. Ideally, we need a tool, a digital tool that works across multiple jurisdictions. We know that Ontario students transfer out of the province, and other provinces have students that transfer in Ontario. We would like to see a version that reduces duplication for institutions and helps them manage their workflow, allows for more timely updates, and helps us really get an understanding of reports for institutions, but also a bird's eye view. So this is really important for us. The other thing that I think that we also see as a real area of potential growth in terms of collaboration is around research and data. And so, again, our colleagues in the West have a history of data collection and data reporting that we would like to see expanded in Ontario. And there are a couple of research topics that I know our colleagues in the West have been looking at, and we have similar interests in them, whether it's looking at research around micro-credentials, how Indigenous students fare and what their interest in their experience of transfer is, and also transfer policies, how they differ province to province, sector to sector. So I think research is another area of collaboration that we've talked quite a bit about and are looking forward to seeing that expand, possibly after the pandemic, or even during. So.
Thanks, Yvette. Anne-Marie?
Yes, thank you. That's excellent highlights, I think, Yvette, around, I would say one of the key questions that we've all landed on, agreed upon, is this ability to have interoperability, collaboration, information sharing, increased student information access to help support student mobility, right? To help support credit recognition of prior learning. I think it's so key. And with that, support for the CAT-CAN network initiatives and collaboration, including the technology and data research and alternative pathways working groups that Yvette made reference to, I think is one important start. Absolutely, as a part of this question that we're in right now about some examples of collaboration that we're working on. I think too that Rob directly referenced the LPS data sharing initiative that we have also between us and BC CAT and the transfer guide there. And I think that's so key to be able to start to move towards that interoperability, move towards that innovation that is so important. To be able to also both systems working on out-of-province members in their systems and support for that, support for non-member data so that institutions may not need to be entering as much data if they're in both systems, for example, and try to make that ease of access even better. The easier the institutions have access to sharing that information with effective tools, like BC and Alberta's tools, the better information access for students, which is as our ultimate goal, right? and also increasing institution transfer decisions in the system overall for ease of access for students is a key piece too. I think the planned demos Rob referred to and trying to do some sharing, as Yvette mentioned, with ONCAT, with the Saskatchewan Transfer Credit and Learner Pathways group as well, trying to really see how can we move towards that interoperability, how can we also consider students as a part of that, and student advisors as one of those key groups. That how can we share website and pathways information, for example, within and across jurisdictions, including student supports, also including some of the references to articulation committee collaboration that we could have here as also an initiative. I know certainly between BC-CAT and Alberta, there's been some cross-boundary connections between committees there as well. And certainly would be open to more of that. Our committees have been very open to those pieces. I think some key examples too that cross boundaries, such as the Provincial Transitions Articulation Committee and the high school equivalencies across the country data that they've been working on, I think is key as experts in sharing out through Transfer Alberta Search tool under high school transitions. I think dual credit, our planned student advisors articulation committee, many of these things just start to build that connection that Yvette was talking about that lead towards supporting research and data sharing, transfer credit awarded data collection and collaboration as we've had with BC as well. You bring all these things together to get that sense of participation like we are today in the JAM and like BC-CAT did in our annual meetings for contact persons earlier in October. And as we do amongst each other with the cats, I think it's so important because that helps to lead towards not only collaboration, but true achieving of outcomes together and making our own outcomes even more informed and not reinventing a wheel when really what we need is to be sharing and to achieve that. So I appreciate greatly those relationships and looking forward to even more.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Starting to get near the end of our time here, so I want to make sure we have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So in 30 seconds or less, let's go to this last question, which is really the magic wand question. What needs to occur for us to achieve a national system of transfer? Yvette, your thoughts?
I'm going to repeat a little bit here, but I'm going to say information and data across the country. I'm curious how transfer looks in each province, but also across provinces and regions and different population groups, whether it's urban students, rural students, access-seeking populations. As I mentioned earlier, given the population and number of institutions in Ontario, not having that picture in Ontario or the country is a real gap. And so I'm going to say, data across the country would be great. It's going to be really important, is to have that information, and especially if we were to look at how the pandemic affected outcomes. So I'm going to say data and information across the country.
Great, thanks, Yvette. Can't have enough data. Anne-Marie, your thoughts?
I would echo that statement and talk about that shared research and data to inform decision making and effectiveness of the systems and add increased student access to information. I think that's so key, and that is directly supported by the conversations had here today about shared terminology and definitions for transfer, and also the data sharing across jurisdictions for interoperability, recognition of prior learning and credits, and potentially supported by things like a pathways toolkit to have key information access for students across jurisdictions, kind of like a national sort of database behind the scenes, but also having a front-facing piece where students can see that information, like some of the realities you talked about, Rob, about the Aruk National Network, and also potential through the Aruk transcript and transfer guide to have some of the updates in there to really bring to life, I think, what we can have, which is recognition of pathways in Canada. And I think that's so important for student access to education and success.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. And I want to end on a really positive note because I think we're getting there. And I know we're very excited here in BC with the development of the Atomic TCS and the inclusion of national and international credit equivalencies in the BC Transfer Guide, which is to come in the spring. And that we'll be able to extend that kind of knowledge and information across Canada and share with our partners. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We have time for some online chat and follow-up. And thank you also for joining us for JAM this year. Take care.
All right, welcome back, everybody. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Anne-Marie, Yvette, and Rob Fleming, all live in the flesh. Rob is coming from BC Cat's detective office, as you can tell by the noir lighting he's got going on right now in downtown Vancouver. As always, we'd like you to put your questions into the session Q&A and the chat. And I see some people have already put some comments in there. So I'm going to throw out our first question from Sarah Greelands from Coast Mountain College. How far along are other provinces in joining the TCS system? I'm going to throw that over to you, Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, did you hear me? Okay.
I lost you. I apologize, Mike.
All right. How far along is Alberta to joining the TCS?
Well, it's in the question, which I really appreciate. So in Alberta, we have a learner pathway system, and we've collaborated with BC in their TCS. So between the two systems, we have very similar methodology, data standards, etc. And we're already doing data sharing between the systems. So it's not a question of joining a system as much as it is of connecting the systems and working towards an interoperability that we're having as conversations both between data sharing of BC and Alberta, and then potentially soon to be also there with Ontario and Saskatchewan and others. So it's a great conversation.
Yeah, one of the things that we did collaborate on last summer was sharing information about course catalogs. So for example, when a course in Alberta is changed or renumbered or discontinued, we don't have any way of knowing that. But you do. And likewise, we know when courses change here in BC. And so we did do some data exchange last summer just as a first step. And I think it's probably the first step towards quite a few collaborations down the line. I'll throw that over to you, Yvette, over in Ontario. When do you think you're going to join our system?
So that's a great question. Thank you for that. So in Ontario, we have a system called ontransfer.ca. I would say that it's version 1.0. We haven't been around as long as ACAT and BC Cat. And so we were able to negotiate with our own government, as we would have to, because we're government funded, that quite a significant portion of our strategic plan over the next couple of years is around digital infrastructure and digital upgrading. And so we, Mike and Rob and Anne-Marie will know that we have set up a number of meetings to get to know the systems that exist, including the TCS. I've got folks from the ONCAT team that participated in BC Jam, really to attend some of the sessions that Mike and others were giving to talk about that. So we are seriously considering that, but we have to go through a process of looking at the options and making sure that our government is also comfortable with the choice that we make. But as Anne-Marie said, it makes good sense to make sure that these systems are interoperable. Certainly we know that there's mobility across provinces, and I think that this particularly will be of interest for our university partners as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, if there has been one advantage to all of us working from home is that the CAT-CAN and the BC-CAT network have met far more regularly. We've been meeting basically every 4 to 6 weeks since last spring. And I think that the level of communication has been really exceptional. We've also been having some conversations with the province of Saskatchewan and collaborations with Manitoba. So I think everything is moving in the right direction. We have a question in the chat from Laura Auxier from Trinity Western. For those PSIs who have offered pass-fail changes in 2020, did you update your transcript legends or to denote a unique semester? So are you aware of changes to the transcript practices as a result of the unique impact of COVID-19 and on grading? I'll start over with you, Yvette, this time, and we'll go back to Anne-Marie.
I think it's institution by institution, but my understanding in our conversations with the bodies that represent the registrars in Ontario is that they were looking at some sort of transcript notation. Can't say for sure that it's consistent across every institution, but folks were thinking of doing that to make that notation in the transcript.
All right, and how about you, Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I would concur. It's also an institution-based decision, as Yvette mentioned, and there's still ongoing dialogue for sure. But the importance of needing to track that and to know that those exceptions have happened is definitely a point of agreement.
All right. Rob, are you aware of any changes in transcript practices here in British Columbia?
Yeah, it really is the same situation here, Mike. Schools, particularly that have competitive entry programs or competitive entry admissions period, and have to a lot of scholarship considerations. The pass-fail notation has to be recorded one way or another. But it is variable practice.
All right. I wanted to circle into some late breaking news, and unfortunately, it's not about the American election. But I'm going to ask you a question, Yvette, about because it circles back to a bit of a theme of the day, which is around micro-credentials. And I understand that there was an announcement today out of the province of Ontario. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about it.
Yes, I mean, it is really just fresh in the news. The media hasn't even, I'm not even sure to what extent it's fully known, but the Ontario budget was literally released during the same, essentially the same time as our session. So it's kind of going back and forth a little bit and getting some texts from colleagues. But the Ontario government did announce quite a significant investment towards a micro-credential strategy. I believe at least $60 million over the next years. So it's not insignificant. Details, of course, to follow. There's, but it's very clear, as we've heard, throughout the last 2 days and across a number of jurisdictions, that this is an area of interest. So.
All right, and so why don't I ask you? Why don't I use this as an opportunity to ask you about micro-credentials in Alberta, and how are things progressing on that front, or what are some of the ideas that are coming through from your side, Anne-Marie?
I think they're similar to many of the different items that you all have been discussing here, and I think a key factor is just trying to figure out the right direction and what the strategy or framework, I believe, is the term being used here, would be. I think that there's a survey that's been sent out. They're certainly trying to get a sense of, as Joanne Douglas was talking about earlier, what's happening in that space. They're still waiting for the response. We don't have all those responses back yet. Our post-secondary programs area and the Ministry of Advanced Ed is leading that. But we know that there's institutions certainly developing programming. We know that there's lots of interest in both the certification, the alignment with the Alberta Credentials Framework, etc. So there's definitely lots of activity and more information, I think, to come after the survey is crunched. But the topic is high as far as interest, for sure.
All right. Well, we are getting close to time. I wonder if I might just ask one final question, perhaps over to you, Rob. I wonder if you can maybe just update everybody in terms of what's going on currently with PCCAT and what we could look forward to in the upcoming year.
Well, PCCAT was on a bit of a summer hiatus, as is normally the case. Unfortunately, given the current situation, we had to cancel our in-person conference last year. We did move forward with an online annual meeting because we're considering some governance changes going forward to our structure. So there'll be more coming out to the membership on that very soon after our board meeting next month. We are planning for this year to not have an in-person conference, but we will be doing probably an online one-day conference, so information will come out to folks soon. Yvette is the secretary for the board. I don't know if there's something else you want to add, Yvette, and Anne-Marie is on the board as well.
No, I think that was a good summary. I think also, like a lot of organizations, we are also thinking about our strategic plan and what our priorities are emerging. And even though that some of that conversation was underway, we're in new times now, so there's probably a little bit of reflection that we're going to be doing as well. So.
All right, we do have a late question being submitted here from Wendy Hutchison from Athabasca University. It's a question directed to you, Yvette. Is ONCAT considering opening up their transfer guide to institutions outside of Ontario?
Oh, right. So this is part of the conversation about looking at the redesign of ontransfer.ca. At present, because we are provincially funded, that isn't an expectation that we have. However, when we are rethinking our transfer guide and our new ontransfer.ca website, we are looking at ways that there is going to be connections between other jurisdictions as well.
All right, and so I'll flip that over to Alberta. I know that you have already a policy for BC institutions to be a part of ACAT. I was wondering about whether you are looking to start including institutions from outside of BC and Alberta.
For sure, Mike, and actually we already do. And so we have several out-of-province members that meet the criteria for Learner Pathway System membership here in Alberta and data up on Transfer Alberta. So that's all good. Referred to often as non-member data, as long as you have a transfer decisions and other aspects with members, which are not only members from Alberta, but also we have members from BC, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, And now I'm under the gun and I've missed one because there's 5. My apologies. With that, the non-member data is definitely a key portion for us because students don't stop at the border, right? That they are moving, and we want to support them getting credential and credit recognition. So yes, we have a whole data initiative right now as a push for that as well, and just to get more data in the system so that there's ease of access for students. I think that between that and doing that between what we're doing right now between BC CAT and ACAT to try to between Transfer Alberta and the BC system, be able to share more out. I think that will help to feed both the non-member piece and also potential interoperability as we go. Looking forward to potential there.
All right. Well, really appreciate you guys taking the time. We are absolutely right at time, so perfect timing on this session. So I just want to thank Yvette Monroe from ONCAT and Anne-Marie from Leasing from ACAT. And we'll say goodbye to you. And what we're going to do is we're just going to roll right into the wrap up. So we're going to start with a few comments from Rob Fleming, and then we are going to move into announcing the contest winners. So I'll hand it over to you, Rob.